C'est un grand plaisir de revenir à Paris. Thank you very, very much indeed for this great honour, a great privilege to come and speak to you today. I was asked to talk about my career, and there's an English word which comes from the French called self-aggrandissement. And I didn't want that. I thought, oh no. So I thought, well, what things have I learned in the course of my career? And essentially there are three things. Serendipity, again from the French. Finding something beautiful without looking for it. Curiosity. So you shouldn't be afraid to try things, to explore, to poke, to question, to turn it inside out. And importantly, you've got to be positive, patient, and persistent. If it doesn't go well immediately, keep going, keep going, keep going. They're my three big messages. Research is hard-ish. You have to burn midnight oil. It's a jealous mistress. And you have to present your work in horrible, far-flung places. Someone has to do it. So, if this works, yes, it's working. So, I've been to very nice places to talk about things, and another very nice place where I am at the moment. Let me start from the beginning, a little confession. I was not the most diligent medical student. In fact, I was a very bad medical student. I had a great time. And as you can see, I haven't changed. So I was not very academic, I was not very industrious. I developed the art, the skill of getting 51 for every exam. So I never failed anything, but I never excelled in anything. I just did enough. But I had a good time. But I still qualified as a doctor, and I won a prize for extracurricular activities. I had a good time. So my early career, I trained as a junior doctor. I eventually got my postgraduate exams. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I liked looking after sick patients. I'd never done research. I'd never thought about doing research. And I started working in a hospital in the northwest of London, a district hospital. And I had come from a teaching hospital, St. George's, where I loved managing unstable patients. You know, I'd learned to put in Swan-Ganz catheters, and it was fun. But the hospital I was working at didn't use them, didn't want to use them, so it was frustrating. How do you manage these difficult patients blind without any information? So I had to do without. Serendipity. Right place, right choice, right time. It struck. I was working for a gastroenterologist, and he read this short article in the Lancet because he knew I was frustrated. I wanted to measure hemodynamics, cardiac output. He saw this short article looking at suprasternal Doppler measuring cardiac output. And the editorial, written by a guy in Scotland, said that this technique goes a long way towards the objective of a simple, safe, reliable and cheap means of assessment. Oh, that sounds good. I looked up the references, and the guy who invented the technique was a guy called Henry Light. And Henry Light happened to work very, very close to where I was working, all of 10 kilometers away. So I rang up just to see was he still there. He was about 3 months short of retirement. So again, serendipity. Had I waited another 3 months, I would have missed him. So I introduced myself, I went along, and he showed me his equipment. And it was this sort of great big machine, and he got like strips of thin toilet paper with the waveforms. And you had to take the waveforms to a bit pad and measure things out. So it took time. But, you got pretty pictures. And so he lent me this great big machine, and I took it back with me and started using it as a clinical tool. And that is my hand about 30 years ago. It hasn't aged a day-ish. And this is an example of a patient. So if the mouse is there. This is somebody who comes in, an elderly chap with a myocardial infarction. A few days later, he reinfarcted, went into cardiogenic shock. And you can see how the waveforms, which represents the stroke volume, much, much smaller. And then he went on increasing doses of inotropes and things improved, not far back from where he was at the beginning. Oh, it worked. And time and again, it showed my clinical acumen up. I thought I knew what was going on. The machine told me something different. And I even published my first papers. I got into this research lark. Again, serendipity struck. I bumped into this chap at a meeting on Doppler. And he was a cardiologist I worked for when I was an intern. And I said, "Oh, hello, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm into Doppler." He used to disappear on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't know why. He did research. In fact, in the 1970s, he did some of the very early work looking at valve gradients with aortic stenosis, mitral stenosis, non-invasively with Doppler. So he was into Doppler. And he said, "I tell you what, use this company's equipment." So this is a patient with pacing. Oops, sorry, let's go back. This is a patient with pacing, 50, 70, 90, 110. You can optimize it. He put me in touch with a company called Doptech, which is now Deltex, and they modified a machine, and now I had color. And this is another patient who needed pacing, and you can see it's much easier, much prettier, and you could measure it on a screen with a light pen. So technology moves forwards. I thought, wow, this is great. However, try as I couldn't actually keep the probe in place. So I couldn't do continuous monitoring. So I thought, oh, any other routes? I went back to the anatomy books and thought, oh, perhaps in the esophagus, because it's very close to the aorta. Again, more serendipity struck. So the hospital I was working in was a community hospital, but had a very big cancer center. And they had one of the first MRI scanners in the country. And the scanner arrived, and the radiologist didn't know how to use it. And so we made a deal. I'd find him volunteers to have MRI scans. He would do measurements for me. And as you see, the descending aorta is very close to the esophagus. I also had a very kind pathology department, so they did lots of measurements for me in the post-mortem room. And with the engineer at Doptech, I sent him, this is a large bore nasogastric tube. I sent the anatomical requirements along to him, a tube along to him, and he made a probe that he fitted in the machine, into the NG tube. And I tried it, and it worked. Wow, this is fun. More serendipity. When I was at St. George's, I'd worked with David Bennett. And David Bennett, many of you hopefully will remember, he was a great intensivist, sadly died a few years ago, very interested in hemodynamics. He was also interested in suprasternal Doppler. So I said, oh, give me a job so I can do some research on this esophageal probe. And it went very well, and you know, that's what the machine looks like now, and it's used quite heavily around the world. There are about 30 countries. So we did lots of papers together. And there have been lots of studies looking at perioperative fluid optimization using it, showing that you can optimize the amount of fluid during an operation to the benefit of the patient. And again, it's got recommendations in the US and the UK as a tool to help optimize perioperative management. More serendipity struck. Just as I was finishing my research, I'm a physician rather than an anaesthetist by background. Just as I was finishing, there was one post in the UK, academic post for a physician who wanted to do intensive care. So it came up just at the right time. I applied for it and I got the job. So I moved to where I am now at University College. So there's the main building and that is the new hospital. But when I arrived, that's the new hospital, wasn't there at the time. This is what the hospital was then, and now it's a research block, and my lab's in that block. So my next challenge, yeah, we can measure cardiac output. It tells you how much cardiac output is being pumped to the organs, but it doesn't tell you if it's enough. And the things we measure, the urine output, the lactate, as markers of organ perfusion are relatively non-specific and fairly late. So I thought, can we do better? So I thought, well, it's easier to do it in animal models rather than patients. So I thought, oh, I'd need to set up an animal lab. So I asked my professor, please, sir, can I have a lab? And he said yes. So I got a lab, and slowly over the years, we've developed it, and now we have lots of toys and tools and techniques that we can operate in our rat intensive care unit. You know, echocardiography, metabolic monitoring, flow probes, etc. So you can really delve down into physiology. You can take blood samples, tissues, and look at the biochemistry, the biology. And we have a whole variety of different models, some lasting up to several weeks. So the problem is, when you're thinking about poor perfusion, it's often the problem of a lack of oxygen. And the holy grail is to measure at the mitochondria, because that's where most of the oxygen the body uses is metabolized. That would be the holy grail. Can we monitor at the mitochondrial level? I think that is still very, very technically challenging, but at least you can do it a little bit upstream at the tissue level. And essentially, the tissue PO2 represents the local balance between supply and demand. The oxygen getting there is being used, and so what you're left with, the tissue PO2 tension, represents the balance between supply and demand. So we looked at it in different animal models, hypoxia, hemorrhage, sepsis, and so forth. This, for example, is in the bladder, and this is an animal that we hemorrhaged, and then resuscitated, and then progressively hemorrhaged down. And it tracked very nicely. For example, in this case, aortic and renal blood flow. And we showed it in a variety of organs, liver, kidney, muscle. The bladder was actually quite a good surrogate of these deeper organs. And so I thought, well, that's in rats. What about something a bit bigger? And Peter Rademacher, who's a lovely guy in Ulm in Germany, has a pig ICU, 55-kilo pigs. And so we did a load of studies with him, looking at the bladder PO2 with hemorrhage, different drugs, hypoxemia, and so forth, and it worked. And here, for example, you can see the changes with hyperoxia and hypoxemia, but the base deficit and the lactate hardly changes. So it's all very well doing it in animals, but at the end of the day, we're here to treat people. So can we translate this research to man? And we've got now the grants, and hopefully in a few months we'll be starting in man looking at bladder tissue PO2 monitoring. So through a Foley catheter, modified Foley catheter, the electrode goes into the bladder wall, and hopefully, time will tell, but hopefully it will prove a quick, easy way of picking up early on if patients' perfusion is being compromised. Behind that, we've got a few other ideas coming through. A happy cellometer. So wouldn't that be nice to have a happy cellometer where we can see if the tissues are happy with the amount of perfusion they're getting? So the tissue oxygen can drop, but is that compromising? Is that making the tissues unhappy? And so we're looking at light using NADH fluorescence. So I won't go into the detail, but it looks at the redox state. And this is again in an animal model there on the muscle, hemorrhaging the animal, and you can see the tissue oxygen's dropping. There's some compensation. This is the laser Doppler flow dropping, some compensation, dropping. And the NADH signal, you can see, goes up, the animal compensates, recovers, goes up, and then it gets to a point where it goes up and stays up, and then deteriorates and dies. And again, we've shown in models that we can use that to see when to intervene with the animal. And so we can then reverse the mortality of the animal by intervening only when it gets to this sort of severe point that doesn't improve. So potentially, and we're trying to work to deliver that to the patient, but that's a few years behind. We're also, again, I love toys, devices, gizmos. Antibiotic monitoring, can we do it better than we're currently doing? So we're working with a small British company to do microdialysis in tissues as well as in blood. Maybe, who knows, but maybe it will be very useful in terms of knowing if we're under or over treating our patients. And we can do it at the bedside and get the results at the bedside. So this is all the device development, and again, serendipity struck again. When we were doing work in a septic model, this is a short-term model with endotoxin, the animals got sick, the cardiac output, either depending on how much endotoxin we gave, went up or went down, but we found consistently that the tissue PO2 went up. That was a bit surprising, because in hemorrhage, in hypoxemia, it went down, but it went up. That made me curious. I thought, what's going on here? It suggests that the oxygen's getting to the tissues but not being used. And as I mentioned before, most of the oxygen the body uses is used by the mitochondria. So could it be a problem with mitochondria? And if you remember, I wasn't a very good medical student. I wasn't very good at biochemistry. But I thought, I'd better find out a bit about biochemistry. So again, by serendipity, where I'm working at University College, there's some of the best mitochondrial labs in the country. So I knocked on their doors, collaborated with them, and they taught me a lot about mitochondrial biochemistry, and we did a whole load of studies. So this is one paper we did a number of years ago where we took muscle biopsies from patients and looked at their bioenergetics, and we found there were differences between survivors and non-survivors, between septic and non-septic patients. And to my mind, this was quite intriguing. There seemed to be this sort of mitochondrial depression, shutdown, inhibition. And this paper, I'm really proud of this paper actually, and it's nearly got 600 citations in the literature. So, you know, it's, I think, to my mind anyway, a lovely example of how you translate a finding you make in a lab model to the patients and see that it can be reproduced. And that's led me on to thinking more in detail about, well, what's going on with organ failure? When you look at the histology of organ failure, after sepsis or whatever, the organs look remarkably normal. So it's a functional rather than a structural problem. So it suggests that when you have a critical illness, you have this widespread sort of inflammatory, hormonal, metabolic, bioenergetic response. Initially we try and fight, and if we can't win, the body changes strategy to then try and cope with this prolonged critical illness. And so as a result, perhaps there's a shutdown, a diminution of energy production, metabolic rate, and therefore a reduction of normal cell processes, perhaps then leading to organ dysfunction. But although we call it failure, potentially it may be a good thing. The body's learning to adapt, adopting a new strategy, shutting itself down, hibernating, to try and get through this prolonged illness in the hope that the insult goes away, it can recover and return back to normal. Serendipity, yet again. So, in 2005, a group in Seattle did some work with hydrogen sulfide gas, and they gave it to mice and showed that the mice could be put into a state of suspended animation. The hydrogen sulfide inhibits mitochondrial respiration. So within a few minutes, the oxygen consumption, CO2 production was significantly lower, and at 6 hours it was about 15–20% of normal. They stopped the gas, and then within an hour, the animals were back to normal. Running around the cage, their IQ was back to normal. And they showed that the temperature in these animals would drop precipitously. The metabolic rate, as I showed you, dropped precipitously. So they had a startup company, Mark Roth, and the guy who was the scientific officer I knew, and he sent me some of the liquid form of this drug, and we tried it in our rats, and it didn't work. We went up and up and up and up on the dose, nothing happened, the animal died. However, a few years later, a colleague at UCL said, oh, could I look at an oral copper chelator? It's used in the United States for Wilson's disease as a possible antiplatelet drug in sepsis. And I thought, it's not really going to work, but he's a nice guy, so I said, okay, we'll try a few. But we got the drug, we dissolved it, and we smelt the sulfide. It's got a very characteristic rotten egg smell. So we thought, oh, this drug is releasing sulfide, and people, it's been around for 100 years, this drug, people actually hadn't recognized the fact. But when we gave it to our animals, it actually did put them into a state of suspended animation. This is in an awake animal, or actually an anesthetized animal, this model. And we could, just by increasing the dose, reduce its oxygen consumption by about 25%. And then we've gone into a whole variety of models: hemorrhagic shock and reperfusion, myocardial ischemia reperfusion, brain ischemia reperfusion. And if you give the drug just before the reperfusion, it can protect. So this is in hemorrhagic shock, and we could halve the mortality, because by temporarily switching off the mitochondria, you're reducing the reactive oxygen species and therefore reducing the degree of reperfusion injury. So a chance discussion with somebody, could you try this drug? We noticed the smell because we'd been playing with the drug before. We thought, oh, let's apply it to another application, and it seems to be doing some good. And we're now trying to get it into man. So there's a small company, and they're trying to get the funding to get it into man. So hopefully in the next year or two, we're looking for human volunteers. Anyone out there who wants to try it, let me know afterwards. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, what are the messages I'd like to give you? I think persistence. Just because it doesn't come to you immediately, think, well, okay, there's something in this, let me persist, let me try and improve the technique, and you'll get there. Focus. The beauty about research, it's easy to go off in 10 million directions. So you've got to try and remain pretty well focused. Yes, it may be that your research has to go into a different direction, but it's important to try and retain focus. The other problem, though, you need the focus, but you need the breadth. Because if you just completely focus and read and learn about one small thing, you miss all the other applications and pathways and things that feed into that. And so you're at risk of perhaps ignoring really important findings purely because you know everything about a small area and not enough about the breadth of science in general. If you get a funny result, and it's a repeatable funny result, don't just ignore it, ask why. What's going on here? It's a serendipity factor. Something just turns up which doesn't make sense. There must be a reason. If it's worth exploring it, explore it further. That was my point about why do patients get organ failure without the organs looking structurally damaged. So there must be a reason. I say the same to my oncology colleagues. How does cancer kill you? And they go, what? Well, how does cancer kill you? And they go, well, it does. But how? The patients waste away and die. Occasionally it will block a blood vessel or an important tube or something, or perforate through something. But most of the time the patient sort of deteriorates, loses weight, catabolic, cachectic, and dies. So I said to them, rather than trying to cure the cancer, why don't you have a different strategy so the patient can live with the cancer but not die from the wasting away, from the cachexia? And they go, huh? But my job's to treat the cancer. And I said, no, perhaps you'll do better by changing your strategy. The so what question is really important. You know, I encourage the people in the lab who are great, and I encourage them to challenge, to argue, to discuss. and they have lots of ideas, and they know my first question will be, so what? How's this going to change? How's this going to make me interested to say, yep, carry on, look at that topic? So I think the so what question is a really, really important question. Stay curious. The beauty of staying curious is it keeps feeding the brain, it keeps you active, it keeps you challenging yourself. It's too easy to just do the same job day in, day out and get into a rut because, yes, you are doing the job competently, but you want to push yourself that bit further, to challenge yourself. So the curiosity factor, to my mind, is really, really important because it keeps you animated, interested, enthused, and hopefully it helps your practice. And I can still bounce out of bed each morning looking forward to the day ahead. Oh, how's that? So on that note, I'll finish. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'll finish with a Steve Jobs final thought. I'll leave it up there for you to read, but I think it's quite a nice quote from him. Thank you.